It's an honor to have you, sir. He's a professor of computer science at Bar-Ilan University, where I had the honor of lecturing just this past year. But going to get to him in a moment. I want to read to you first, and I want him to hear. Actually, I'll put you back on there. I want you to hear, Professor. I'm sure you're aware of this, but I'll read to you the front page description of this in the New York Times last week. Israeli law declares the country the nation-state of the Jewish people. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel has long demanded that the Palestinians acknowledge his country's existence as the nation-state of the Jewish people. On Thursday, his governing coalition stopped waiting around and pushed through a law that made it a fact. In an incendiary move hailed as historic by Mr. Netanyahu's right-wing coalition. By the way, I just want you all to understand, this is not an opinion piece. This is a front-page news piece in the New York Times. This is the reason the president calls the media fake media. This is not a news story. Incendiary move is an opinion. Okay? Denounced by centrists and leftists as racist and anti-democratic, Israel's parliament enacted a law that enshrines the right of national self-determination as unique to the Jewish people, not all citizens. Okay, so Professor, before we answer the universal, or not universal, in other words, around the world critics, let's deal with, in a nutshell, explain to my listeners what the law was that the Israeli parliament passed.
Okay, it's actually a rather brief law. It has only 10 paragraphs. The first one states that Israel is, in fact, the nation-state of the Jewish people, and the other ones just explain what that means. Israel's symbols, its anthem, its flag, its calendar, its holidays, connection to the Jewish diaspora, law of return, its language, its capital city. That's about it. It's, actually rather benign stuff if you read the law, pretty much consensual. It's not obvious what the fuss is about between you and me.
Right. So it struck me that all these descriptions of it deprives non-Jewish citizens of rights, which, by the way, if it did at all, I would oppose it. But it struck me that was, and I just have to fall back on this word, just a bunch of lies.
That's absolutely correct. If it had taken away any rights whatsoever from any individual citizens in Israel, minority or otherwise, I would have opposed it as well. This law does no such thing. I should say as background that Israel does not have a constitution, and instead it has a bunch of basic laws. One of the basic laws that was passed in 1993 is the law on dignity of man, and the dignity of man basically has the usual list of human and civil rights, which apply equally to every citizen in the state of Israel. This law is specifically about the character of Israel as a nation state, and includes the things I mentioned before. It doesn't take away rights from any individual citizen. It doesn't give rights to any individual citizen. It talks about things like symbols and flags and whatnot, which is, Israel is not ashamed to say and should not be ashamed to say are in fact Jewish, because Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people.
Yeah. So I always, since I was a child, I've always had two questions. What happened, which we're discussing, and then why it happened. So I have two questions. Why the necessity of passing this bill, which you worked on, and B, why the intensity of the anger against it? So let's begin with one. Why did you feel it was necessary to pass such a law to begin with?
Okay, so the answer to that question is that Israel has an extremely activist and extremely left-wing Supreme Court. Now,
gee, forgive me. That's to an American, that is a shock that could happen.
Well, in the United States, the appointments process is a little bit different than in Israel. Kavanaugh now was nominated by the president and is going to go through the process of being ratified or not by the Senate. In Israel, the justices in the Supreme Court are actually appointed by a committee. And 3 of the 9 members of the committee are actually members of the Supreme Court itself.
All right, hold it there, please, Professor. This is really important. Please understand, folks, that was the issue, the Supreme Court, not the Arab citizenry. You'll understand in a moment. Professor Moshe Koppel of Bar-Ilan University, my guest. Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager here, speaking to a professor in Israel. I'm going to get to him in a moment. It is about this new law in Israel, codifying that Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people. Doesn't strike me as particularly radical. There are 52 Islamic states on earth. There are 22 Arab states. I don't exactly know why it bugs humanity that there is one Jewish state. Of all the 200-plus nations and of all those other nations that I just mentioned, it seems to annoy the world that there be one state the size of New Jersey, smaller than El Salvador, that calls itself Jewish. But we'll find out more about it, why they even passed this to begin with in a moment. Okay, now we have a good chunk of time with our professor in Israel, who was one of those who authored this bill. You were explaining why it was even felt necessary to pass it. Go on.
The story here is actually the Supreme Court. So, as I was saying, the Supreme Court is in a sense self-appointing. There's Supreme Court justices in Israel, unlike in the United States and in all other countries, are actually appointed by a committee of 9 people, 3 of whom are sitting Supreme Court justices. Now, you need 7 out of 9 to approve an appointment. So that means that the judges effectively have a veto on the appointment of any new judges. Now, the justices in Israel, for historical reasons, tend to be rather left-wing, kind of cosmopolitan, look somewhat askance at the whole idea of a Jewish nation-state. And they, for decades, were kind of pulling Israel in the direction of becoming a more, let's just say less Jewish in its character. And the official legal reason for this, as I was saying, Israel does not have a constitution. What it has is basic laws, which are more important or have a higher status than regular laws. And the way the judges interpret this is that there's a conflict between a basic law and an ordinary law. Well, the ordinary law can be ruled unconstitutional for that reason. And there already is a basic law that gives all the usual human and civil rights. That's the law I mentioned, basic law, dignity and freedom of man. But there was no basic law that made Israel a Jewish nation state. As a result, whenever there was a conflict between the two, the judges would take into account only human and civil rights. They would never take into account the collective rights of the Jewish people. This law comes to address that asymmetry.
So give an example. Would one of, I have no idea if this is accurate, but would one example be whether or not the national anthem can be what it currently is, Hatikva, the hope, specifically speaking of 2,000 years of dreaming to return to Zion, because obviously Arab citizens or non-Jews would not be yearning for 2,000 years to return to Zion.
That's correct. Now, in fact, until now, the Hatikva, the hope, has been the national anthem, but that was only in a regular statute, while, as I said, the basic law, dignity and freedom of man, is a higher status. Now, the judges, there had not been any case where somebody petitioned the Supreme Court to rule that Hatikva was unconstitutional for that reason, but there was always the potential for that. Okay, so there were cases where people petitioned the court where there were conflicts between Israel's Jewish character and general rights, and the court invariably ruled in favor of the petitioners in those cases. We were concerned that given the trend, given the court's trajectory, one day the national anthem or the flag and other things of a similar nature would be ruled unconstitutional. This is kind of a rearguard action to prevent that from happening.
I see. So it wasn't, as I obviously read, it was not directed against anybody. Does an Arab citizen lose a single right as a result of this basic law?
Not a single right. Absolutely not. When you just say the flag is the flag and the language is the language, there are no rights that any individual citizen has that would be lost.
Okay. All right. So when we come back, I'll read you a litany of attacks on this basic law, and I'll have the professor who was one of the people who wrote this, Professor Moshe Koppel, professor of computer science, Bar-Ilan University in Israel. All right, everybody, I am speaking with Professor Moshe Koppel, professor of computer science at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He worked on the bill that granted constitutional status to Israel's identity as the nation-state of the Jewish people. Now, this passed narrowly, actually. The parties to the left all voted against it. What did they cite as their basic reason?
You know what? That's really an odd thing. They suddenly discovered that the law was, in their words, undemocratic. It was unfair to minorities and so forth. Now, a little background will suggest that maybe this is all just kind of a political ploy. One of the members of Knesset who was most vocal in their opposition to this law is a Druze member of Knesset by the name of Hamed Amar. Hamed Amar was actually a co-sponsor of the law in 2011. It was a version of the law almost identical to the one that passed, actually a little bit less moderate than the one that passed. He was a co-sponsor. Now he decided that the law is undemocratic. Another member of Knesset named Yoel Hasson from Tzipi Livni's faction of the Labor Party decided this law is the worst thing that ever happened. He was a co-sponsor of the law in 2011 as well. So it's hard to take seriously all the arguments being made by the members of Knesset on the left against this law.
I try to be objective about it and see why it would adversely affect a non-Jew in Israel, because I care about that a great deal personally. And I couldn't figure it out. I mean, for example, Arabic was, along, I think, with French, one of the three official languages of Israel, or had French already been demoted?
English.
I'm sorry.
So I'll give you the background on that one. That was actually from part of British mandate law. The King's Council had actually declared Arabic, Hebrew, and English as being official languages before the state had been established. And then when the state was established, English was eliminated. In 1948, English was eliminated as an official language. So that the status of Hebrew and Arabic was kind of a holdover from mandate days.
All right, Professor, forgive me. I would like to do a part two with you because there's just too much to learn. I've been honored to speak to you. Got a break. You're listening, folks, to the Dennis Prager Show.